For most producers, music theory is one of the most complicated and boring topics when it comes to music making. But trust me, it's also the secret to getting really good sounding tracks. If you've ever tried learning music theory, it's really easy to get overwhelmed with all of the complex topics it has to offer, like memorizing key signatures, learning complex harmonic structures, and even learning how to read music. It's a lot. And if you try to learn all of music theory all at once, it's like trying to drink this entire jug of water. But for most music producers, you don't need to know all of this. All you need is a small piece of the music theory puzzle to get some great results. Much better. Why did I have to pour an entire jug of water on myself? And that's why I'm here. In the next 30-ish minutes, I'm gonna show you everything you need to know about music theory as a music producer so you can get started making some amazing sounding songs. So wet. Alrighty. Yeah, baby. Okay. To get started with music theory, I have brought out my piano for today's video, as you may have noticed. Pianos are probably the easiest way to understand the notes and the way they interact with each other. Although you can do it on something like an acoustic guitar or a trumpet, it's gonna make a whole lot more sense visually with pianos themselves. Understanding the theory first on the piano is what I would recommend for most music producers. To get started with the piano, we first need to discover what the names of the notes on the piano are. The musical alphabet works really well for all of the white keys, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and repeating itself over and over again at the different octaves. However, if we want to talk about these black keys, we have to do them in a special way. They don't get their own letters, but instead they get something called a sharp. A sharp looks like a pound sign or a number sign after the original key. And anytime you sharp a note, you are going to go up a half step from that original note. A half step is just the next neighboring note to that white note. For example, if I went up a half step from G right here, I would go up to a G sharp. But if you notice, if you look on the screen now, you'll see that it says A flat. A lowercase b, that's the notation for flat. And that is also a way we can talk about black keys. We can talk about them as going down a half step. Anytime we go up a half step, we're going to go up a sharp. Anytime we go down a half step, we're going to go as a flat. So this would be A flat because we're going down one half step from our original A note. Hopefully that's making sense. Let's go over some of the other black keys to make sure you have this point. This key right here is E flat. We have E here, and we go down a half step for that flat, E flat. We can also call this one D sharp. Both names are interchangeable. And now that we've talked about some of these note names, I'm going to leave the note names up on the piano keyboard at all times so you can follow along. Notice that even though this is C sharp and D flat, I've just left it as D flat. The only sharp that I'll be dealing with is F sharp, which is the most common of sharp names. The rest of them are commonly referred to as flats, so I'm just going to keep it like this to keep things simple. And now that we have a basis of what the note names are and where to find them on the keyboard, let's begin diving into scales. Scales are also very closely related to keys, which you may have heard either of those names. A scale sounds like this. You may have heard something similar before. It sounds like the basis of your elementary school music class, hopefully, if you had one. For this very first scale, I'm going to teach you the C major scale. Then we're going to dissect its formula, and we'll be able to play a major scale anywhere you'd like to on the keyboard. Understanding this formula is going to be a way better strategy than just memorizing all of the keys. You will memorize the keys eventually, but if you have this formula and insert it to, let's say, E flat or A flat, then even without knowing the exact notes of the major scale, you'll be able to put the formula in and play the notes as if you did know it. Let's go into C major. C major is the most basic scale to get started with on the piano because it doesn't have any black keys in it at all. When you start on a major scale, in this case C major, we're going to start on our root note. Because we're in C major, we're going to start on C. As we go up the scale, we're going to play all of the white keys until we end back at C. Then we're going to unwind it. But basically, in C major, all of these notes are fair play. That means if we were in the key of C, which you might hear musicians talk about sometimes, all of the notes that we'll be playing are these 7 notes. Notice I said 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Then we have C again, and it repeats itself. There are 7 notes to each major scale. And anytime you hear a song that's in a specific key, they are using variations of those notes in that key. If you're trying to solo in C major, it would be a good idea to use those specific notes. Now let's dissect the pattern here as we were talking about C major. I've already introduced the concept of half steps when we talked about flats and sharps. But now let's introduce the next concept of a whole step. If a half step is just going to the next neighbor, a whole step would be going to 2 neighbors over 1. So that would be a whole step. Between C and D, there is 1 note in between. That means it's a whole step. Half step from D to E flat, 2 half steps equals a whole step. D to E is a whole step. So as we're going through this major scale, we can use these correlations between the notes. If we keep track of these steps as we go up the C major scale, we can move this scale and use it on different notes. For example, we can use it by starting on different notes, and this will allow us to play in different scales and different keys. Let's continue on with this formula. Whole step, half step, whole step, whole step, whole step, half step. So the formula for a major scale is whole, half, whole, half. If we use that same formula and start it on a different note, you'll find that we can still play a major scale. This time, let's start it on G. G major, whole step, half, whole, half. Now notice here, I couldn't play a white key. This time, I had to go from a half to the whole step, so I had to play the black key. And occasionally that will happen. I chose some easier keys here to work with that have less black keys, like C major and G major. But as you get into some more complex keys, like C, D flat, or C sharp, you're going to have to play a lot more black keys. The same formula still applies. If you use this formula, you'll be able to play in any major key that you want to. That formula is super important, so remember it for those major scales. Also, if you want a detailed guide on some of the most common chord progressions that I've just gone over, I've actually included a free download in the description below that will show you all of the most common scales. It will also show you all of the most common chord progressions you can play in those scales so that you can get going with some of those chord progressions. There's also another really highly popular type of scale you'll be dealing with as you produce music, and that would be minor scales. Let's go back to C major. Instead of playing all of the white keys for a minor scale will flat the 3, flat the 6th, and flat the 7th note. If you know the major scale, you can apply that same formula and then play the minor scale. Let's do it with C minor. Notice the difference in tone and timbre that it has. Minor scales are often more somber, melancholic, a little bit more darker than their major counterparts. And just like their major counterparts, we're going to dissect the formula behind it so that you can use it on any starting note. Let's try this. Knowing we have E flat, A flat, and B flat, and then the rest are white notes, let's go through this scale and see what the formula is. Whole, half, that's different. Whole, half, whole, half. Whole. There you go. And so that means our formula for a minor scale would be whole, half, half, whole. A little bit different than the major scale, and that's the reason it sounds different. Let's start on a different note now and determine what this minor scale would be. Let's determine what the A minor scale would be using this formula. Whole, half, whole, half, whole. So all together, sounds similar to the C minor scale because we use the same formula, but because we started on a different note, it sounds slightly different. We're playing in a different key. Instead of C minor, we're playing in A minor. If you notice something special about the A minor chord, the A minor chord happens to be all white keys, just like the C major chord. And that's because they are cousins. They are relatives of each other, as we say in music. A relative major and relative minor chord have the exact same notes. The only difference between them is where you start with the root note. In C major, starting on C, you get C major. So using those same notes, but starting on A, you get A minor. You can always tell the relative major or minor by using this formula. We have C major here, and if we go down 1, 2, 3 half steps, we will have our relative minor. Similarly, if we're in A minor and we go up 3 half steps, we'll have our relative major. Let's try this for a trickier key like E major. This is what an E major scale looks like using that same formula. If we go down 1, 2, 3, we can play that same exact minor scale with the same notes. C sharp minor. I'm using those same formulas for major and for minor to use those on the scales. After a while, you don't have to think about these formulas as much. You will just eventually memorize the notes that are in each one, and you can also use your ear to tell you if it's right or wrong. There are a bunch of other scales that you can get into when it comes to music theory, but for 99% of the time you are dealing with in music production, these are the scales you'll want to worry about: major and minor. And after you have a good grasp of major and minor scales and the formulas that I've just given you to make them on anywhere, let's hop into some chords. Just like we have major and minor scales, we also have major and minor chords. We'll get into minor chords in a second, but we'll start with major chords. Major chords are formed when we play more than one note of a scale at a time. If we just play the first note of the scale, in this case C major, and we play the fifth note of a scale, in this case G, we have the basis of a chord. Most times chords are made of 3 notes though, and the most common note we add in the middle would be the third. So we add 1, 3, 5. The way I'm getting those numbers is just by counting up the scale. I always have the 1 as the root note, and because we're in C major right now, I will use C as the 1. Then we'll go 1, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And so I have 1, 3, 5. And if we play them all together, we get a C major chord, a C major triad, as it's also called. Triad because there are 1, 2, 3 notes. 1, 3, and 5. Now, because we're playing in the key of C major and the scale of C major, we're going to denote this first triad as 1, a uppercase Roman numeral 1. A lot of times when musicians are talking about chords and they're talking back and forth to each other, instead of saying C minor, D flat minor, they're just going to say 1, 2, 3, 4. It's way easier to talk about chords in that regard. And after you watch this video, you're going to know what those 1, 2s, 3s, and 4s mean, that you can communicate the language of music in that way. This is a great starting chord. We have our C major chord. But what should we play in our left hand or in our bass when we're actually producing music? It's a good question. Oftentimes, we'll just play the root note to reinforce the chord itself. Our root note and our chord itself is C. So that's the 1. If we play the 1 in the bass, we'll get a more full sounding chord. It's also pretty common in piano and a lot of genres to octave this bass note. So I could play C with an octave like this. Notice how much more full that C major chord sounds. We can do the same with minor chords. Let's take the C minor scale we talked about earlier and do the same exact technique. We're going to take the first, the fifth, and now the third. But notice, instead of playing the major third, as it's known, we're going to play the minor third, or the flat third. So, if you know what a major chord is, say for example G major, you can just flat the third, and you'll have a G minor chord. So, for this though, we have C major, we're gonna flat the third, give us C minor. We can do the same thing with the bass as we did before, supporting those root notes of C by playing an octave bass in the double in the left hand. in the left hand. Notice the difference between major, and it sounds kind of regal and jolly and good, and minor. It sounds a little bit darker, a little bit more introspective maybe, and maybe a bit sadder. Those are the tones of the major and minor chords, and combining them together and using multiple chords in a row is called a chord progression. And chord progressions are the basis of what you'll be doing as a music producer. Sticking with C major to keep things easy, we're going to talk about chord progressions in C major. As you go up your C major scale, you can make a chord starting on each of these individual notes. In C major, we have C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C. So the next note after C major would be D. But notice, we want to stay in the key of C, in the scale of C. C does not have an F sharp like a normal D major chord might. So instead, we're going to play D minor. There's actually a cool chart that you can follow that will work with any key that you're in, but it goes like this. The 1 chord will be major, the 2 chord will be minor, the 3 chord will be minor, 4 major, 5 major, 6, minor, B. We won't worry about that now. It's a version of a minor chord, and back to the 1. The most important chords you'll be dealing with in chord progressions are 1 through 6. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. In those 6 chords, there are 3 major chords, the 1, the 4, and the 5. And there are 3 minor chords, the 2, the 3, and the 6. Let's use that same formula to talk about another scale that we've been working with a little bit in this video, G major. G major, we're gonna go up the G major scale, but notice we added an F sharp here as our 7th note. So G major, we have the first major 1, minor 2. Notice I had to play that F sharp to get the B minor chord. Major 4, C major, major 5, D major, minor 6th, E minor, the weird 7th chord I talked about that we won't worry about for now, and back to the 1, G major. Hopefully that's making sense. Once you know the scale of something, you can follow that specific formula to know what chords to use. So now that you know those Roman numerals and you're getting the hang of it a little bit better, let's hop into an actual chord progression in the key of C major again to make things easy. We're going to use those chords that we learned and just put them in an order that we like so that it sounds good. Let's try something like this. C, F major, A minor, G major. And notice, I'm outlining that bass with my left hand. C, F, A minor, G. My left hand is supporting the bass notes by supporting and playing the root note of each chord that I'm moving to in my right hand. Notice that it sounds pretty weird for me to just kind of play these chords in perfect triads like this in chunks. It's actually going to sound a little bit better if you move the notes around, and this is called an inversion. If I have C major here, I can also move E, G, C up to the top and still have those same 3 notes, but now it sounds slightly different. Check out this C major versus this C major. I can do the same thing now. I can move E to the top. That's still C major. Or I can move up here. I'm still playing the same notes, but it's going to feel different. Let's check out that same chord progression with some inversions in the right hand. C, F, A minor, G. Notice I was using the same 3 chords as the triads from original, but I just inverted them as I played so that I moved my hand less and it was less work for me in the long run. I also think it sounds a little bit more interesting than the original blocked chords that I was playing before. We often denote these chord progressions by the numbers that they're actually represented by. So in this case, we would have 1, 4, 6, 5. You don't have to say 6 minor or 2 minor, but just know if you're following the conventional chords as major 1, minor 2, minor 3, major 4, major 5, minor 6, you don't have to say anything after it. You can just say 4, 1, 5, 6. Let me show you another common chord progression in C major. We have D minor, G major, C major. That's a really common progression in jazz, and it's called a 2, 5, 1. Well, Sunday morning rain is falling. So now that you know the basics of chord progressions and how to keep them in the key of a song, let's work on embellishing those chords so that they sound a little bit spicier, a little bit nicer. Nicer? You got what I'm saying. So let's start off with 7th chords. There are a few different types of 7th chords that you need to know. Sticking again with the key of C major. A 7th chord is kind of exactly how it sounds. We're going to add the 7th note, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 of the chord to the chord. And if we do that, we have B. This is called a major 7th because the B is a B natural. It's in the scale. It's in the major scale. Sounds kind of jazzy, right? We can also drop this B down a half step to get what's called the dominant 7. And this sounds a little bit more, I don't know, this also sounds jazzy to me. I don't know how to describe this. A little bit more bold, I would say. The dominant 7 is the more typical way of playing the 7th chord. And if you have something written like C7, you will play the dominant 7. The only time you would play the B natural or the natural 7th would be if it says C major 7th. And yes, it does have to have major before it for it to be that particular note. There's also a minor 7th, and there's only one type of minor 7th. If we have C minor here, we have the dominant 7, the flat 7, just like we do in the C7 but we can drop that third down a half step to get C minor, add in the seventh, and we get a C minor 7. Sevenths are one of the most common things to add to chords, and they can really spice up your playing. Let's check out what this same chord progression sounds like with a seventh chord added in. So for this chord progression, to add some sevenths in, we're just going to do it nice and easy. We have D minor 7, then we have G dominant 7, G7, and C major 7. Nice. And just like before, we can invert those to wherever we want to. Instead of playing D minor always like this, we can move that C down and play it like this. Now, I'll break down what I just did there. I did D minor 7 by adding in the notes here, having that C in my D7 chord as well. I did a G major 7th, but I left out the G in the right hand. Because my left hand was playing it and supporting it with the root note, you don't always necessarily need to voice that in the right hand. I left it out, it still sounds full. And then my last chord was something like this. I left out the root of the C major, and I kept in the major 7th here to get a nice jazzy sounding chord. We're still in C major. I'm just voicing that root note with my bass rather than with my right hand. Hopefully that's making sense. That's a bit more advanced, and we'll get into those more advanced topics at the end of this video as we begin to dissect and break some of the rules that we're learning about here. Now that you know the seventh chord, there's another note I want to introduce to you that will be really helpful for you as a music producer, and that is the 2, or the second of a scale. In C major, that would be D, 1, 2, okay? If we add in D to our chord progression, we have what's called a C add 2. We are just adding it in. Alternatively, we can have what's called a sus chord or sustained chord by taking away our third, in this case E, and adding in 2. This is what a sus chord sounds like. That would be a sus 2, and a sus 4 would be adding in F instead of E. Nice. We have C, E, G as our main chord. Let's add in the 2. Just giving it some more color and some more spice. Let's go in with a different chord progression and use some of those add 2s and 7th chords to make them even spicier. Here we go. C major add 2, A minor 7, F major 7. Some other things you can do to add some spice to your chords is just either drone on like the first note or the 5th note and add those into each of your chords. So in this case, 1 and 5, I'm just gonna add into every single chord that I'm playing, no matter if it works or not. So first we have C, D7, A minor, G add 4 or sus 4. You can hear it sounds really good, and all I'm thinking about, I'm not thinking about those specific chords that I just mentioned. I'm just thinking about adding in that C to every single chord so that it sounds cool. Let's try the same with the 5th. Here we go. A lot spicier and more interesting than it was before, for sure. There are a bunch of other types of chords and embellishments that you can add to chords to make them sound even spicier, but for our purposes and for most music producers, that is all you need to do to get started. You're 99% of the time going to be using that 7th chord, maybe adding in some other notes in the scale as well to make it sound cool. But keep it simple. Really, the simpleness and the simplicity of the chords themselves is going to take you a long way in music production. Are you enjoying this video so far? Are you learning something from it? If you are, go hit that like button. Go hit that subscribe button. We make videos like this every week that will help you take your music production game to the next level. Now that I've taught you the basic rules and the guidelines for major scales, minor scales, chord progressions, and so on and so forth, I'm gonna teach you exactly how to break them. As with most things in music production, before you break the rules, you have to know the rules first. So please watch this beginning part if you didn't understand any of that. The first thing we're going to do in breaking the rules is to play notes outside of the scale. Sticking with C major to keep things easier, we're going to learn 2 types of chords that break these rules specifically. We're going to learn an augmented chord. An augmented chord will take the 5th note and sharp it. In other words, go up a half step. So an augmented chord sounds like this. A spicy chord. The other type of chord we'll learn is called a diminished chord. A diminished chord is similar to a minor chord, but with the 5th flatted. So this is a diminished chord. We have augmented, 1, 3, sharp 5, and a diminished chord. 1, flat 3, flat 5. Most of the time we use a diminished and an augmented chord are as passing chords. In other words, they're not exactly in our chord structure. They're passing chords because they aren't maybe as long as some of the other chords. We use them and touch on them because they sound very distinct. They sound a little bit out of place. But if we touch on them just for a second to get to another chord, we can get some really interesting results. This was a C major, C augmented to F, D minor, G major, C, etc., etc. It sounds a lot more interesting than just going from C major to F. We can do the same thing with the diminished chord. A cool way just adding some spice into your chord progressions with some quick passing tones. And now we're getting into one of my favorite parts about unique chord progressions, and that is changing the typical 1 major, 2 minor, 3 minor, 4 major, 5 major, 6 minor to the opposites of them. You can get some really cool chord progressions and some really colorful tones. There's some more advanced music theory behind the scenes here, but if you just think about those topics and then change them, you're gonna have some cool results. We'll leave the 1 as is because we're in the key of C major, and for this to work, we have to have some basis of our root and our root scale. We can go for a major 1 to a major 2 instead of a minor 2. Well, I was driving around town with the girl I love, and I'm like, forget you. Sound familiar? It's used in a lot of songs. Ain't got nothing but love, babe. 8 days a week. Sounds really cool. Another cool one, moving up the scale, would be the major 3 instead of minor 3. Let's take a chord progression like this. C major, A minor, E major 7. What a spicy chord. Yeah. Instead of using an F major, we can also use an F minor. I really love this combo with the following chord progression. We have 1, then we have a dominant 7-1, then we have 4, and then we go into 4 minor. Super spicy, super nice. We can also do the same for a minor 5. Let's go for 1, 4, sounds a lot different than it would otherwise. Let's go in for a major 6th chord. I don't hear a lot of major 6th chords in popular music, but hey, maybe that's all the more reason to try it in your songs. Let's go for a 4 to F, G, right? Sounds like a Mario theme song maybe. There are, of course, some popular songs that use this chord progression, but it's not as common as some of the other ones I mentioned, and I find myself using it a little bit less, but it's still fun to experiment and change those minor and major chords to the opposite to just experiment with all of those. Chances are, if you like it, other people will like it too. But for most music producers, they don't have to worry about reinventing the chord wheel, just using some of the basic chords and the stuff I talked about in the first part of the video, and then maybe some 7th chords, and maybe switching some of the chords so that they play around and they get a little bit more interesting progressions is all you really need to get started with music production. Remember, you can always go back and rewatch any of these concepts so that they feel a little bit more concrete. And as you continue to practice these, they'll become second nature, so you don't really even have to think about them as you're producing. Remember, you can download that free chord chart and scale chart in the description below if you want some extra help as well. And I'll see you in the next one. Time to go take a shower.